and welcome to Check Your Thread, the podcast that will help you sew more sustainably. My name's Zoe and I'm obsessed with sewing. I've been blogging about it for over 14 years and I'm the creator and host of the popular handmade wardrobe challenge, Me Made May. But like many people, I've become increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and the way that my lifestyle contributes to it. So in this podcast, I'll be nerding out about making clothes whilst exploring how to minimise the negative impact that it may have. I really hope you'll join me in this journey. This week, we're widening our investigations into sewing more sustainably to include quilting and textile art. I've spoken to quilter and textile artist Bridget O'Flaherty, who makes the Threads of Sustainability podcast. You'll hear our discussion on the many parallels between our respective disciplines in relation to sustainability and some of the areas where they diverge. Stay tuned for that. But first, I must know, how are you doing? How's your May shaping up? I'm doing okay. I've been having lots of revelations this week about my Me Made wardrobe, largely thanks to my Me Made May workbook and the mid-month reflection page. My handmade wardrobe is currently serving me well, but it doesn't feel particularly exciting. And because I haven't actually expanded my clothing selection very much since last May, I don't really think that there are many new-to-me combinations of clothing to be discovered. So that part of my challenge pledge has proved to be a bit redundant. Yet, I am committed to the Last Sewist Standing challenge, so all being well, I won't be buying new patterns or fabric until February next year. So I've been thinking up ways to have more fun with getting dressed without making new stuff, by considering accessories, footwear, makeup, hair, jewellery and stuff like that I generally make very little effort with most of the time. But speaking of new wardrobe additions, I've finally finished my patchwork denim quilted jacket and I love it. I shared a little reel of it on Instagram and I'll get some proper pics of it soon and put them on Instagram and on my blog for those who are interested. Sustainability-wise, last week I mentioned that Saturday was World Bee Day. Well, I'm not done banging on about bees. My kids and I made our little bee hotel. Before making it, I did some research on the best designs for bee hotels and I found an interesting article on a website called Entomologist Lounge. I've shared it in the show notes for anyone else wanting to have a go. But providing nesting sites isn't the only thing we can do for our bee and pollinator friends. Here are some others. Fill our gardens or any outdoor space with pollinator-friendly plants. If you're looking for inspiration, there are heaps of lists online that will be specific to your geographical area. Allow lawn weeds to flower by cutting less often. You may have heard of the initiative No Mow May, which is happening at the moment, which is designed to encourage us to do this, or rather not do this. Provide water for pollinators. This one I didn't know about. So I'm guessing that some pots around your outside space that are allowed to collect rainwater or that you fill up from time to time might work. And avoid using pesticides wherever possible and never spray open flowers. So there we go. There's some other options. Okay, some Check Your Thread news that I've failed to share for a couple of weeks. We recently hit a milestone that is worthy of celebration. We've now had 250,000 episode downloads. Yes, that is 250,000. How epic is that? So massive thanks to you for listening and for subscribing and sharing about the podcast. So there are no new patrons of the podcast to thank this week. So instead, I'm going to take a minute to thank everyone who has left a rating and review in your podcast app of choice. It makes a big difference to the visibility of the podcast in the apps, and it provides social proof to other potential listeners. Here's a couple from Apple Podcasts, if you'll indulge me. This one is from Nickname99. Zoe gives lots of easy-to-follow ideas that can easily be incorporated into your lifestyle. She does this without sounding preachy, just helpful. The guests are always interesting too. Well, thank you for that one. And another one, this is from Recycler. This podcast is a light in all this darkness. I listen to help lift my spirits and to feel inspired by other people doing good things in the world. Also, sewing. I love that one as well. Thank you so much. Thanks again, everyone who's left a rating and review. I've heard quilt artist and podcaster Zach Foster refer to the reviews left by his listeners as love letters, and it honestly feels like that. It's a great free way to support the podcast, so if you can spare a minute to do so, I'd be incredibly grateful. Right, so on to today's episode. As I say, this one is with quilter and textile artist Bridget O'Flaherty. This is actually the second half of a podcast swap that Bridget and I agreed upon. We discovered each other via Instagram, and once we discovered how many parallels there are between what we're trying to do, we decided to get together to find out about more of our similarities and our differences. The episode we recorded for Bridget's podcast has already aired. I've put a link to that in the show notes in case you'd like to hear that one. So take care of yourself, take care of your local bees, and enjoy. Hello, Bridget. Thank you so much for agreeing to this podcast swap. I'm really, really excited, and welcome to Check Your Thread.
Hi, Zoe. It's so great to chat with you.
So I discovered you and your podcast because you made an episode of your podcast, Threads of Sustainability, with a previous Check Your Thread guest, Eliu Hernandez.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed your conversation with Eliu because it was so wonderful and it was so open, and I was really touched by it. So I'm going to put the link to that in the show notes because I think that everyone should go and listen to that. But that's how I discovered you. And then I discovered your podcast and realized that there's a lot of parallels of what we are trying to do with our work. So I just thought it'd be lovely to explore that more with you. And I'm very grateful that you've agreed to do so.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I've been following you since I started my podcast, actually, because, as a podcaster who's doing sustainable things, I wanted to see who else was doing stuff out there. So I've been following you for quite a while.
Oh, awesome. So please, can we kick things off in the usual Check Your Thread way? Please, can you tell us who you are, where you are, and what fills your days?
Yeah, sure, I can. I'm Bridget O'Flaherty, and I am in Perth, Ontario, Canada. What am I about? I have been doing thread painting and quilting for a little over 30 years. And I have also had a parallel career in sustainability and doing energy efficiency in residential buildings. So I was learning a lot about material use and impacts on the environment of various different decisions people make around material use for buildings. So then I started to take a look at it with my quilting and wanted to kind of see what the options were out there. And my early research doing it and early days of trying to get into it, it was really hard to find anything. Like there weren't material options available. And in the last 5 years, that's exploded. That's totally changed. And I started seeing other artists. Of course, the internet also has changed things, right? Access to different people who are doing things which didn't exist when I first started doing my quilting. Like that wasn't there. I had to learn by trial by fire and figure things out on my own. But now we've got this huge resource in the internet, and so the things are just changing. And I started having these really exciting conversations with people, and I really wanted to focus on sustainability in textiles and quilting and help educate people around that. And all of my quilt stuff now has some layer of sustainability in it now, and my teaching as well.
Fantastic. So what are you doing when you're not making your podcast? Like, what are you doing throughout your week? How does quilting and fiber arts kind of actually manifest into your week?
Into my week. So I have 2 full-time jobs basically.
Oh,
so
wow. Okay.
I still work in that industry of energy advising for residential housing. And
right.
Yeah. So I still have that as my full-time day job. And then I have this full-time life of creating and talking to people about sustainability. So I guess my world would look like I deliver courses. I teach the thread painting that I do. And I'm working on a new piece right now I want it to be a showpiece. So I'm working on a big showpiece right now. So I do natural dyeing and I do upcycling and thrifting for my materials in the first place. And then I get my backgrounds together and then I do my design work. My quilting and thread painting, I do all on my long arm sewing machine because it's like I got a giant hoop. It's really exciting to have this great big.
So tell us, what is thread painting? Like, that's not something that I've heard of before.
Oh, okay, yeah, right.
To listen to your podcast.
Thread painting is basically free motion embroidery work. So I do landscape pictures, a lot of nature, animals, flowers, and all of the detail is made with thread on my sewing machine. There is thread painting that's done by hand, but that I don't do that. I do it by machine because it's faster, not easier, but faster. And yeah, so all of the pictures that I create are made from layers and layers and layers of thread.
Right. What came first, the quilting or the thread painting, or how do those do you kind of thread paint on quilts? Like
Yeah.
are they separate things? Are they together?
The quilting definitely came first. I started like a beginner quilter. My mother taught me how to quilt. I did traditional quilting, textile, like piecework. I created some sampler quilts. I did some contemporary quilting, more modern style stuff for a little while, just with geometric patterns and color and, shading. That was a lot of fun, but I really wanted to try landscapes somehow. And so started learning how to do landscaping with fabric, doing strip piecing and that kind of stuff. But I always wanted to add a little more detail. So that's when I started
Right.
introducing the thread painting on top of what I was doing, just having a little bit of shading underneath a dock that I had put on there, or some grass, or, to hide the feet of a bird because I can't draw feet really well, that kind of thing. So I started just adding more and more thread painting. Now my entire work is based on the thread painting and I quilt around that. So they're wall hangings,
Right.
they're art pieces. They're not
Sure.
bed quilts.
Right. So what is your definition then of like quilting more sustainably? Like what can that look like?
It's a really big, broad, I don't know, it's huge, right? There's lots of different
Sure.
ways people can approach sustainability. It can be about the materials that you're using. So you can use safer textiles so that have certifications if you're wanting to buy organic or Okotex or something like that. So you can buy, if you're buying new materials, buy safe materials so that that they've got some kind of credibility to them, some background, somebody's checked and made sure that they're made ethically first of all, so that the labor behind them is well managed and fairly treated, and then the environmental impacts are lower. So you've got that accountability when you have certifications behind what you buy. So that
Hmm.
could be the materials, or you can be upcycling, using
Hmm.
materials that are already in existence. Use clothing and cut those up into your materials for your
Sure.
quilts.
I mean, there's the big tradition of that, isn't there, within quilting of
Absolutely.
reusing clothing that's no longer fit for purpose.
Yeah, I think that we kind of shifted somewhere along the way, and I'm not sure how we got lost in all of that, but that's how quilting started, right? We started using clothing and
Yeah.
upcycling flour sacks, and it was never brand new material in the early
No.
days of quilting traditions. So, somewhere along the way, we kind of got caught up in this commercial commodification of materials, and now we're stuck in this big marketing churning system of the next designer is sending out their next line and we got to get that. And we've got too much fabric on the world right now. There's too much material on the planet.
Yeah.
We need to start using
Absolutely.
what we've already got and slow that down a bit. So the upcycling part's a really important part, I think. There's repurposing as well. Like there's people who are out there using materials that have nothing to do with traditional fabrics for quilting or textiles. They're starting to use found materials and plastics and other materials within their textural work. And it's really, really cool stuff. There's lots of ways we can start repurposing different materials.
That's really exciting.
Yeah.
So how switched on, generally speaking, do you think that the quilting community is to sustainability and the potential impact of their like consuming and creating? Like, is it still very, very niche? Is it a conversation you're hearing more?
Well, I'm hearing it more because it's what I'm talking about.
Well, you're listening in, I guess. Yeah.
So,
I mean, it's
but
hard, isn't it? But do you feel that those conversations are being had a little bit more broadly, or
yeah,
is it
they
slow?
absolutely are starting to be a bigger part of the conversation. I don't know if you noticed or saw just a couple of days ago, the Festival of Quilts that happens in Birmingham just announced a sustainability category, which
Ah,
is
cool.
amazing to see a big show like that. And in Canada, we have a national show as well. And our national juried show has introduced a sustainable award as well. So it's starting to happen more and more. That
Mm.
same organization in Canada had me write a few articles for their member magazine about sustainability and
Oh,
what it should
cool.
look like. Yeah, it's been really exciting. I did 3-part. I have one more to go, and you can actually read those online. There, you can go to the Canadian Quilters. There's a blog, and you can read those articles.
Can I
Yeah,
put them in the show notes?
yeah, I'll send you a link for that. But yeah, so I'm starting to hear like that kind of support from national organizations and big shows is going to start sort of putting the ideas into people's minds around what sustainability can look like. And so, yeah, I am starting to hear more and more conversations. I would say until this last year, though, it's been very niche. I would say it is a sub community at this point.
Yeah. So when you're talking to kind of more, I don't want to use the word traditional, but maybe those who haven't kind of started considering the sustainability of what they're doing quite as much. So what kind of questions do they have of you? And like, what are they surprised to learn about your approach?
They're surprised to learn that their hobby that they feel like is really, really good for them because they love doing it has a negative impact. They're really surprised to learn that they're part of this bigger textile community because they are, right? Like they are part of that bigger textile industry. We're not a separate situation. They didn't know. They just didn't know. I do give talks to quilt guilds, and there's almost always at the end of my talk a bit of stunned silence because they just are they're shocked. They didn't know that there was this negative side to what they're doing because they love what they're doing. And generally speaking, quilters are really, really generous, and they make a lot of donation quilts, and they do a lot of community projects, which is all part of sustainability too, right? They're generally doing really great things already, but it's this material piece that for me just it got lost somewhere along the way, and they're starting to realize, oh, I can make different choices. So the more we start to ask for different things, the more we're going to get those different things.
Sure, sure. Like, for example, asking what organic selection you have in your local quilting shop and things like that.
Exactly, and there are different threads out there now, and they are getting more and more common in quilt stores. Not super common, but you can find them in the occasional quilt store.
So what threads do you use?
I use a couple of different ones. I use a lot of Gutermann. They have an what's called an RPET thread. So it's the recycled polyethylene, 100% made from recycled bottles. So plastic bottles.
It's the equivalent of one plastic bottle per reel, isn't it?
Yeah. And so it's they're 100-meter spools, and they behave just like polyester thread, regular polyester thread does, except it has that recycled piece to it. So it's got a bit of circularity to it. And then it's going into an art piece, which isn't going to be thrown out, I'm assuming. Hoping.
Plus also it's not getting laundered, so it's not necessarily shedding microplastics in the way that garment sewing would contribute.
Yeah, I also do use cotton, organic cotton threads when I can.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's always about the shade. Like I need the right color in order to represent what I'm doing. So I can't always find it in the sustainable thread that I want to use because they only have limited shades.
It is limited, isn't it? Yeah, I find the same with garment sewing. You obviously need to match the thread color to your fabric. And what about linen thread? Have you used linen thread?
I haven't seen linen thread. I've got linen material, but there's linen thread.
Yeah.
Where do you get that?
Yeah, apparently there's linen. I don't know. I hear some hand quilters use it. I've never come across it because I'm not a quilter personally, but yeah, I heard that's a thing, and I was like, that's fascinating. Apparently it's really strong.
Well, I'll be looking for it now. Yeah, no, because what my primary work is thread painting, so I go through a lot of thread.
I bet you do. What do you do with the reels when you're
I haven't figured that out yet. They're all in a bin. I'll figure out what to do with them at some point. I'm hoping to in the dream world, I create a recycling system so that people can bring all of their thread spools to me, and I can send them somewhere and they actually get recycled. But
yeah, that's the hope. Yeah,
that's the hope. Yeah, but at this point, they just sit in a bin, and I'll figure that out eventually.
Yeah, that is what I quite like about the organic cotton threads, is that they come on these really pretty little wooden. Well, the ones that I use come on these really little pretty wooden things, and you can like wrap bias binding or ribbon, or you can reuse them. I think a little bit more. Yeah.
I haven't figured that part out yet.
No, same. I've been literally having this conversation in the DMs on Instagram with someone saying, well, why, it's difficult because, for example, with my job, I have a day job where I'm ordering threads for a fabric company, and we use, like a middleman to order. We're not ordering directly from Gutermann. So it's difficult to see how it'd be possible to collect and then send back the items for reuse, but I mean, at least I'm in Europe, so we could potentially post them. But still, that's got to footprint in itself, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in Canada, I don't know what it's like where you are, but the plastic recycling industry here, we do a lot of recycling, household recycling, but only 11% of it actually gets recycled.
I think it's probably very similar to
Yeah.
what's going on, sadly, in the
Yeah.
UK also.
So we've got a long way to go with dealing with plastic.
Yeah. And every borough that we have has different rules and they take different materials. So
Yeah.
what's going on in one street might be different to several streets over.
Right. Yeah. Well, you have a similar thing. I mean, we have longer kilometers between our communities, but similar thing. Like our community only accepts, 1 to 6, and then another community next door might take 1 to 8 in terms of the triangle number on the plastics.
Sure. Yeah. I'm on the very, very edge of a county border. So literally 2 streets away, they have different recycling rules.
Oh my God.
That's really interesting. Okay, so I have a question that I've had for ages. I'm hoping that you can help me answer it.
Okay.
If I was to make a quilt, what would you think is the most sustainable source or fiber type for the batting or the wadding in a quilt?
Oh, the batting is a hard one. I don't have a good answer for that. I would have, like 2 weeks ago, I would have said organic cotton because Hobbs makes an organic cotton batting, but they've just announced that they're discontinuing it.
Oh.
Seems very backwards, doesn't it? It seems like it's a step back.
That's a surprise. What reasoning did they give behind that? Have they not given any?
No, they haven't given any. So I did find online an RPET batting, which I'm excited about trying. I'm going to order one and see.
I have used that actually. I made myself a quilted jacket with
Green
that.
Dream, I think it's called. Yeah.
That's the one.
Yeah.
I didn't love it.
Okay.
It's kind of quite, it's very synthetic.
Okay.
Also, what I found quite frustrating, similar to what you were saying before, is when it kind of blows people's minds. And I was looking at the comments on the website where I ordered it, and there's lots of people going like, "I'm saving the world by buying this." I'm like, yeah, but no,
not really.
They were like very patting themselves on the back. Anyway, it's a whole other thing. But I think that when things are recycled, people forget that the recycling takes energy in and of itself, and that is often fueled by fossil fuels. So it's not a completely free of any kind of impact, is it?
Yeah, no, it's not. And I think that, I've never thought as a quilter, I'm going to save the world. I'm just trying to do a little bit. I'm just trying to do my piece. And that's actually something that I try to really make clear to people, that it's not about one individual doing everything. Like we don't have to do the whole bit around sustainability. I do a lot myself, but I've also been doing it for 30 years. I live off grid. I built.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, I do. I built my own house. I do organic gardening. I do a lot of things in my life that would be considered sustainable, but I don't expect everybody to do that. You got to start where you are and make one choice. Like maybe you decide on your next project, you're not going to buy any materials and you're just going to shop from your own stash.
Yeah.
That's enough.
Absolutely.
That's a decision that's heading towards sustainability. Instead of going out and shopping, you're shopping in your own stash. You're challenging yourself creatively. You've got the opportunity to use up materials you've already purchased. That is enough of a difference. It's enough.
Right. So let's get more into your podcast.
Okay.
So what inspired you to start the sustainability, and what have your goals been for your podcast?
It came out of actually being a guest on another podcast. I was a guest. Yeah, I was a guest on Brandy Maslowski's. She's called Quilter on Fire. She does some amazing quilt interviews of some really amazing quilters that are out there. And she had heard she'd seen a conversation on Facebook around the Canadian Quilters Association and a sustainability group that I have on Facebook. And there's this back and forth. And so she wondered what my story was, like why I was thinking and talking about sustainability. So she interviewed me about it. And then I thought after that, there's a lot of people who don't understand what sustainability can look like in the quilt world. And a lot of people think it's already sustainable. So I want to have those conversations to show people what it can look like. So it's coming back to that question you asked me in the beginning. It's what is sustainability in quilting and what can that be? And it's having these bigger conversations with people all over the world who are doing different things, because the materials is really just one part of it. There's some people out there who are what I like to refer to as artivists. They are art activists, and they're making quilts that have a message and meaning behind them, and they're really important. And that is an important part of sustainability.
Hmm.
And then there's the producers, right? There's people who are out there making products for us to use, and they've got purpose behind what they're doing, and manufacturers. And then there's the certification bodies who are trying really hard to have accountability. I'm interviewing all those people because those are
Yeah,
there's so many different parts and so many different ways we can
absolutely.
approach sustainability. And how can one person who doesn't know possibly unpack it all? That's, I guess, the big goal behind my podcast, is to just give people lots of different ways that they might start to understand how they can do sustainable practices in their own stuff.
Yeah, I see so many parallels between
Yeah.
what we're doing. It's
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
crazy. So yeah, I think that, I mean, both of us we are coming from creative arenas where there are other podcasts
Yeah.
kind of exploring our topics, but you and I both kind of really looking at it from a sustainable angle and kind of shining a light on people that are doing interesting things. And as
Exactly.
you say, like, everyone's coming at what we love from their own angle and their own life and their own experiences. And it's not a formula, isn't it? It's not like,
No.
oh, this is how you make garments more sustainably. This is how you quilt. And
No.
but
No.
by showing lots of answers, lots of interpretations of what that can be, that's going to kind of click with other people in different ways, isn't it? Some
Yeah.
people will really latch on to, yeah, oh, okay, well, I can really look into what my thread choice is. And others will be like, oh, okay, well, I can think about, where I source my fabrics on. So it's really interesting. I also feel that we have very similar motivations as well, because I heard on your very first episode when you was having a lovely conversation with your son Jasper, which was
Yeah.
really sweet. And you said something along the lines, I can't remember the exact words you used, but you said something along the lines of, once you start to do things more sustainably in one area of your life, it's easier to see how that can be applied to other areas of your life.
Yeah.
And that is like literally one of the foundational tenets of my Check Your Threads manifesto. So that was really cool. So what are some of the lessons that you've learned through making your podcast? Like, have you found out anything or been inspired in some way that's actually changed the way that you approach your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually, Eliu was a very big influence on me. Just talking about the deconstruction of fabrics and materials to use all of the bits. And I hadn't thought about the thread piece. Like, he actually deconstructs and saves the thread.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Mind blowing. Because I've been at times in my life, even though I am very sustainably conscious, I get overwhelmed by having all the stuff. I find it really hard to have bins of scraps that I haven't used and
Right.
hanging on to all of these different pieces. I feel guilty that I don't get to them, and I don't know what to do with them. And so just talking with him about some of the projects that he's doing is really amazing. But also realizing that I don't have to do it all yet, that I can be saving it to manifest itself into a project later, that's okay. So I'm starting to realize that, knowing that I am going to use it, instead of just putting it aside thinking, I don't know what I'm going to use this for, but I'll figure it out. I've instead sort of changed my mindset and said, okay, I am going to use that. I have a purpose for it. And I don't know exactly what that is, but I am going to use it. So instead of just having a question mark behind why am I keeping it, I feel better about it. And I feel like I'll actually get to those projects. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You're seeing it more as a resource rather than like a burden.
Yeah, exactly. And he kind of helped me to see that all these little pieces are these magical resources that are just waiting to become something else, instead of this burden of, oh my God, I've got to use those pieces because I'm a sustainable quilter, so I have to do this kind of work. So
I think Eliu as well, he's kind of got the benefit of kind of working within a very limited color palette and within a limited kind of textile range. So I think he's going to get to those scraps quicker than maybe those of us who use a variety of textile sources.
Yes, may be true. I'm looking over at my stash of tablecloths and sheets that I have waiting to be scoured and dyed and made into something at some point. And I keep getting, people actually are starting to bring me stuff now that they know I'm doing this. I'm getting boxes of linen tablecloths and napkins, and I'm like, okay, I don't know what I'm doing with these, but I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to do something with them. So,
Does that
yeah,
feel quite overwhelming?
a little bit sometimes. Yeah,
Yeah,
sometimes, but I also don't want to turn it away.
it's tricky, isn't it?
Yeah.
I was having this conversation with one of my regular return guests, Shams Eldin Rogers. We had this conversation recently about, we're trying to rephrase stashes as like resource centers or resource collection
Yeah.
because of the weird negative connotation that stash can have.
Yeah.
And then we're also talking about the kind of comparative differences that, I mean, this is a vast generalization, of course, but how quite often in North America, homes are quite a bit bigger than they are in Europe, and
Yeah.
how that can also affect your relationship with your resources. Like you have the ability, I'm assuming, to have a bit more space to, I mean, you've got all my scraps in the corner there. And this is my lounge.
Right.
I don't have a lot of space for for storing stuff, and I wonder how that affects your relationship with resources also. If I was to receive a box of table linens, I wouldn't have anywhere to put it at all.
Right.
So it buys you some time in a way as well.
Yeah, it does. It buys me time, but it also it makes me feel like I'm on the edge of hoarding. So I want to be careful about that. I do have a separate studio space, so I am very fortunate that way. And I live in a rural setting as well. So I've got 7.5 acres of land around me,
Oh wow.
and I have my house and I have my studio, but I'm also out in the middle of nowhere by myself. So I can't easily.
So if you run out of thread, yeah,
Yeah,
it's easy
I've got
go
to.
and get.
I have to plan getting my resources if I want to. Yeah, so it is. I guess that is something that makes it easier, is to have that space, but I also don't want to let it go
Yeah,
because
fair enough.
is the potential that it's going to be something really great.
Absolutely. It's really interesting, actually, all throughout what you've been saying. I can see so many parallels between your work and quilting and fibre arts more generally, and the garment sewing as well. Like, for example, our stashes or our resource centers and stuff. For garment sewers, like, that is something that we can definitely do. Like, look at what we've got first rather than instantly going out to buy some more because we want to start a new project and stuff. So,
Yeah.
what do you think generally, like, from what you can tell of discussions with other quilters, like, do most quilters have quite a lot of materials already in their possession?
Yeah. There's been a fairly heavy marketing narrative around, she who has the most fabric when she dies wins kind of thing. And
I hate that so much.
I know,
I hate
it's gross.
Those memes.
And there's also this other part around the marketing that drives me crazy. And I talk about this a fair bit, where the marketing is really hitting towards, it's a very personal saying, like, you deserve this fabric.
Oh,
And
okay.
that, it's kind of playing on all of the, the trauma or the trials or the hardships that people might have gone through. And they're using sewing as a way of navigating that and healing, which it really is. Those things, that part is really true. But they're kind of latching onto that and saying, so you deserve the fabric. And
that's a bit problematic.
It is problematic, and it's really kind of subversive. You don't really see it at first, but it really is. They keep saying you deserve this, and as if somebody else doesn't. I'm not sure who doesn't deserve to be able to purchase fabric if they can. So yeah, I find that marketing angle very problematic, but it is quite rampant in the quilt world. You go girl, you go get what you need. Often they were referencing women because the large majority of quilters identify as women.
Yeah.
So they're always talking to this narrative of, treat yourself.
Right. And the way that it just looks as well, like the ranges of like the quilting cottons, when they bring out a new range and you've got all the prints at different scales, and then there's like the solids, isn't there, that matches in and blends in so well with
and it looks so pretty. It looks so pretty. You go into a quilt store and there's these just rows of beautiful textile colors, and it's lovely, and it really is appealing. They're not wrong. It's beautiful. But does it have to be that it's made from an unsustainable source? Does it have to be all the time?
I was just saying, and presumably once you buy the fabrics for the quilt with all the coordinating solids to go with the prints and stuff, and you don't then use it all, it's going to then build up and you start another project and you've got then more.
And lots of people go to a quilt store for fabric therapy, they call it. And
Right.
they go to just being around the color does make us feel so good, right? It does. It's very appealing, very soothing. There's something I find with quilting, and I don't know if you find this when you go into garment stores, sewing stores or not, but I find with quilting, there's this sort of deep rooted connection to it. And I think because we have a lot of people have quilters in their lives from their ancestry, like their mothers, their aunts, maybe their uncles, whoever, and going distant into their past, their grandmothers who have quilted, and it's part of this memory bank we have. Oh yeah, I remember my mother sitting around sewing. I remember my grandmother having friends over and sitting around sewing, or my grandmother made me a quilt and it just makes me think of her. And so there's this ancestral link when we walk in a quilt store, and it tugs on us. It's like,
absolutely.
Then I'd be honoring my grandmother by buying that fabric.
Absolutely. So, I used to teach sewing and dressmaking classes, and often when I start a new class, just to get everyone kind of feeling a bit more, comfortable with each other, I'd like, start a conversation, but like, oh, so what inspired you to start sewing? And so many people would respond, oh, well, my mum used to make all our clothes, or I remember my grandmother making our clothes. And there is that tie, and even if there has been like a generational gap, there is that memory of, oh yeah, this is something that was part of the lived experience of people in my past. And whether or not they enjoyed it, I think is a really interesting question, because I think often obviously this isn't necessarily applicable for quilting, but possibly when mass-produced clothing became much cheaper, lots of people then stopped making it. And I think, oh, okay, well, how many of those people were doing it because they had to, because they couldn't afford to dress their children in other ways. And I wonder how much of that is not acknowledged. That's just something that I think about from time to time.
Yeah, no, that's totally interesting. I think that's probably true for quilting, maybe slightly less so, because the quilts were always a special item. You could have blankets that weren't quilts, but quilts were always a special item that came from community efforts often. It wasn't usually just one person.
And also, I mean, that is one big difference, I think, isn't there, between garment sewing and quilting, is generally like the use of the item once it's complete is obviously different. Like garments are made to be worn, whether or not they get worn, that's a separate question, but that's what they're made for. Whereas quilts, whether or not you're treating them as an art piece or you're treating them as something to put on the bed that you will use, like generally they have a different life. They're not going to be laundered quite so often, if at all. And they are maybe seen more as like a legacy item, something that you'll pass down in your family as well.
So, and that's again part of that sustainability, right? That those items that we're making are legacy pieces most of the time, not always.
So generally, the quilts and the art pieces that you make, what kind of lives do your projects have once you're finished with making them?
Well, usually I sell most of my work.
Do you?
Yeah. Most of my work is sold. I do a lot of commissions, art pieces that go into people's homes, and they.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so that's mostly what ends up happening with my work. I've had one piece actually was gifted to a national gallery in Canada. So it went to the University of Alberta and then into their collection, their art collection.
Oh, how amazing. So they're being hung largely, like on walls generally?
Yeah. They're usually pretty big pieces. Like the one that's behind me is about 40 by 60 inches. I don't know what that is in centimeters. In Canada, we switch between inches and centimeters.
Same, we do here too.
So a lot of the quilting stuff is around the imperial system, not metric.
Interesting. It's stunning, by the way. Could you describe it?
Yeah, sorry, it's behind me here. You guys don't get to see it, but I'm going to talk about it. It's about 40 by 60 inches, and the background fabric was upcycled. So I got it at a thrift shop, and then I over dyed it with indigo and some iron mordant and some black walnut. And then I stitched 3 swans. It's basically there's a pair with a signet. And then they have the reflection onto the fabric as well. So the swans are really identified, and then there's the reflections below them. And that's all onto that background fabric. And then it's quilted with some textural.
Amazing. Colors are stunning.
And then it's got the 3 layers. So it's got a batting in it. So you're asking more a little bit about the wadding, the batting. I also use wool because it is organic. It's actually certified wool. And I like using wool. I think it's got a nice base to it and a nice weight. I also get wool from my neighbor who lives across the road. He raises sheep. I get a very small footprint. It's like the 100-mile diet. I get the wool from him fresh off the sheep and I wash it, I pick it, I card it, and then I use it. I felt it and use those felted backgrounds for doing I stitch right onto it. Or sometimes I will use it as a surrounding piece to be a backing, to be a wadding for me. But then I also buy commercial wool.
Awesome. So I've only got a few more questions. I'll be quite quick. So I'm sure that you're aware that there's a fairly recent trend of making clothing out of old quilts.
That was going to be the question I was going to ask you.
Oh, well, you can. I'll ask your thoughts so you can ask mine.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that trend?
Okay, so this is a really big topic and I have a bunch of different feelings around it. One of the feelings is it's ridiculous to use an old quilt and make it into a fashion piece that is on trend right now and won't be next year and will end up in closets and back in landfills because it's no longer usable as a quilt. So that part of it pisses me off, to be honest. On the other hand, there are a lot of quilts out there that are amazing quilts, but aren't really something you would put on your bed anymore. They're not usable as bed quilts. They have holes in them. They are threadbare. They are materials we wouldn't use or want on our beds. They're colors we wouldn't necessarily use that same way. So what's happening to that quilt if it's not going to be used as a quilt? Might as well be used as clothing. So I'm on both sides of that. I think the short or the long answer, I guess, is it depends on what the origin of the quilt is and what the end use is and who's actually using it. Is it being used? How is it being used?
Okay,
how's that for an answer?
No, I love it. Okay, so do you have any specific tips that you could offer up to my community that maybe we could apply to our practice of garment making more sustainably?
Well, I think it's pretty much just what we've already been talking about. Use your stash first. Use those resources you've already got. Don't go shopping for new. And yeah, just that idea that if you are going to shop for new, maybe you're upcycling it. Maybe you're looking for materials we have a few different online communities here where you can buy sort of second use materials, stuff that is like at the end of cycle. What do they call them? Like offcasts or offcuts. And they'll sell those. So there's still decent amounts of fabric and they've never been used for anything. Or we have also communities that are selling their stashes. So people are putting up their stashes for sale. So they've never been used, but they were cut off the bolt already, but they're basically new fabrics. So there's that way of shopping instead of commercially shopping. And then if you have to commercially shop, look for certifications, OEKO-TEX or Global Organic Textile Standard or the Global Recycling Standard. Look for these certifications on the materials. And if they don't have them in your store, ask for them.
Yeah, because they're not going to start supplying them unless they think that there's going to be a market for them.
Exactly.
So what other makers working in quilting or fibre art spheres do you find inspiring? Like, who should we investigate? Give me a few that are inspiring you at the moment.
Okay, Zach Foster is doing some really great stuff. Yeah, Eliu Hernandez is another great guy. In terms of thread painting and an artivist, Janine Heschel. Oh my God, her work is unbelievable. She did a thread painting for the Jane Goodall Foundation of a chimpanzee. It looks like a photograph. It's amazing.
Really?
The work is incredible. And she's using Aurifil, so those are OEKO-TEX threads.
Awesome. Okay, so if listeners want to find out more about you and your work, where can they find you?
I am on social media, Instagram and Facebook as @ the Sustainable Quilter. And then I have my website, bridgetoflaherty.com, and you can find me there. And if you want to listen to the podcast, it's called Threads of Sustainability.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Bridget. This has been really, really fun.
Thanks so much for having me, Zoe. It has been really fun.
Thanks so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed this episode and are left feeling inspired. For more info about the podcast, including show notes for this and every episode, head to checkyourthread.com. I'd love to hear from you, so if you have any comments, questions or ideas for future episodes, please get in touch by emailing zoe@checkyourthread.com or find me on Instagram @checkyourthread. Massive thanks to Patrick Potter for production support, to Sylvia Seller for the awesome logo design, and to Simon at Palm Skin Productions for the music. This ad-free podcast would not be possible without listener support, so if you feel you are able, please consider signing up to the Check Your Thread Patreon. For the equivalent of buying me a coffee each month, you'll be making it possible to continue producing regular episodes. Links can be found in the show notes and on the website checkyourthread.com. I hope you'll listen again next week. Until then, take care. Bye!